So why Francis? Just straight into it.
When Pope Francis was elected in 2013, he was sitting next to Cardinal Claudio Hummus from Brazil. And he leaned across to Jorge Bergoglio, the previous Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires, and says, "Don't forget the poor." And that got Francis thinking. And so a few minutes later, the world was told our new Pope was Francis, after Francis of Assisi. He's the first Pope in history to be called Francis, but it was the perfect saint's name for Pope Francis because he reflected Francis of Assisi so well. First of all, Francis of Assisi was a man who was captivated by God. And that was the story of Jorge Bergoglio, the son of Italian immigrants in Argentina, called to be a priest, a Jesuit priest, but was always captivated by the Christ. And we knew him as such as a man who was captivated by the Christ by the way he preached. He really sank deep into the heart of God, but also into the humanity of and struggles of people and our world. Francis was in particular captivated by the poor Christ, and so was Francis. As Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires, he lived in one of the barrios, one of the neighbourhoods, one of the poorest of the lot, Flores. And so he knew people in this barrio. He would talk to them in the streets. He would sit down and have a drink with them. He would take the bus to the office rather than being chauffeur driven.
Did he?
And so he knew people's struggles. Yeah. And Francis of Assisi was also a man who had a great love for the creation and the beauty of this world, this common home that we call the earth. And Francis, our Francis, was exactly the same. Francis of Assisi took part in the Crusades, but he broke away from the crusading armies and went, and this is in the 1200s, and had a dialogue with the Sultan trying to broker peace. And so our Francis too was a man of peace. So an incredible example of a saint, but a pretty incredible example of a pope who tried to live that to the best of his ability.
So Francis the Pope?
Yeah, Francis the Pope. And I think one of the things that I've been fascinated watching is with Pope Benedict and Pope Francis when they came out to the balcony for the first time. And with Pope Francis, when he came out, he just seemed to be staring at the crowd. Yeah. And nothing seemed to be happening. And I just thought, say something. Yeah. But what I didn't realise was that there was actually a band playing the Vatican national anthem down below. And you couldn't hear that on the official coverage. But when he started speaking, it was so different. He just went, "Brothers and sisters, good evening. Fratelli e sorelle, buonasera." And so suddenly, it was an image of a pope who was going to be more intimate, of close to his people, who was going to talk to them in a different way. Another thing that was incredible that night is he asked people to pray for him and to bless him. And he bent down before the crowd while everybody in the square that were gathered that night prayed for him. "Please pray for me" was a constant refrain. He knew his need for God's mercy and his grace. He wasn't doing this under his own power.
Yeah, everybody I know who has met him, that is what his final words were to them. "Please pray for me."
Exactly. That's exactly right. And that's been the occasions when I've met him too. I've had similar sorts of words spoken to me.
How many times did you meet him?
I've probably met him half a dozen times.
Oh, wow.
But most of them it's just handshakes
and a kind of passing.
and a kind of passing. The most extensive one was the visit of the New Zealand bishops to the Holy Father as part of our ad limina visit, where we had about 45 to 50 minutes speaking with him, and straight away he put the agenda out on the table. He said to us, "There's nothing that's not on the table. If you don't like me, or if you don't like what I'm doing, I'd rather hear it from you than read about it in the media." Wow. And he says, "I want you to be free in what you say." So he was really, really quite interested. And then there were other little things too. He says, "Now you'll notice that you've got a bottle of water and glass there." And sure enough, beside each one of us, there was a bottle of water and an ordinary glass. His glass was a lovely crystal glass for his glass of water. At a point in the interview, he filled the crystal glass with water and then handed that to his translator. And I thought, well, the flunkies still haven't got it. He wants to be just the simple priest and pope. But even more than that, he preferred to refer him to himself as the Bishop of Rome rather than as the Pope.
Wow. What was that meeting like? I mean, without obviously going into specific details about the meeting.
My perception was, as we started, that there was a certain nervousness about him.
Yeah.
That he didn't know what he was going to get from us.
Okay.
As he just set the tone, if you like.
Yeah.
His first question was to turn to, as he was then, Bishop Paul Martin of Christchurch. He said, "You've had the earthquakes, you've had the mosque attack. How's Christchurch?"
Wow.
And it was straight into, he really wanted to hear how the people of Christchurch were. But it was the whole time he was really wanting to understand the church in New Zealand. We'd had to write reports to Rome ahead of our meeting. He was well briefed, but he was wanting to know, what were our struggles, what were the signs of hope, where did the church need to go? And he was quite free in what he spoke about. But it was also, I think, as time went on, he became more relaxed, and I really got the feeling of him sensing, these guys are on the same page as me. And so that was quite good. The other interesting thing that was interesting about our visit is we didn't get to meet all the heads of the various Vatican dicasteries because the Amazonian Synod was going on at the time, and so we were able to reflect on what is happening on the Amazon today about the destruction of the forests and people being displaced from the land and losing their languages and culture, about making the comparison with what happened with Māori in New Zealand and just the challenges that's meant for the church and how the church at times has failed to live up to its part of engaging with Māori. But he was quite fascinated by that, and as part of the conversation, he reflected on his meeting with Kingi Tūheitia, and he just kept emphasising what a humble man he was, and so he really obviously touched the Pope quite deeply. And at the end of the visit, Cardinal John Jew said to the Holy Father, we always, in New Zealand after a meeting like this, we'll sing a waiata, a hymn, and we've been doing it throughout Rome at our meetings, but we want to sing to you a waiata written by Bishop Jean Baptiste Pompallier, our first bishop. It's in Māori, but it sings the praises of Mary, the first disciple. And so we sung Mō Maria. The Holy Father was head down, and at the end of it he just looked up and he almost had tears in his eyes, and he just shook his head and he said, "Thank you, no other bishops' conference has ever done anything like this." So it was nice to have a little touch of Aotearoa New Zealand in our encounter with him.
I wonder, because I was reading his what he wrote about his wishes for his burial and stuff, and he talked about his relationship with Mary as being really quite deep. And I don't know, I'm kind of just imagining how special that would have been for him, given his own relationship with Our Lady. I mean, you've met him in passing and all that sort of stuff, and I guess working as a bishop. You would have had, I guess, a special relationship with his work. Do you want to go into that stuff now?
So first of all, I'll just talk about his relationship with Mary just really briefly.
Yeah, okay.
And I think for some Christians, outside the Catholic Church, they don't really understand this relationship that Catholics have with Mary. But for us, Mary is the example of discipleship. She was the one who was obedient to the will of the Father, open to the Holy Spirit, and who conceived Jesus in her womb. And like every one of us, she had to learn to be a disciple. But she also had that insight as to who he was. And so at the wedding feast of Cana, it's she who's saying, when Jesus says, "Woman, what's this got to do with me? It's not my hour yet." She ignored that and said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." And so that was the lead into the water changing into wine. It was the push of Jesus out into the world, into mission. And that going out into the world in mission is what the church is called. And then Mary is the one who stands at the foot of the cross as her son suffers and dies, but also from the cross, Jesus gave her to us as mother, into the conversation with the disciple of John. This is your mother. And so Francis knew Mary as this warm, intimate woman who, as she prayed for the outpouring of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost on the church, continues to pray for us in heaven, united to the heart of her Son. She's the one who prays for us. And so whenever Pope Francis was facing a big question, a big challenge in the church, or doing an overseas trip, he would first go and pray before Mary, asking for her intercession for him and the work that he was doing. And I think, mission is really at the heart of Pope Francis's pontificate. His first apostolic exhortation to the church, Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel, really talks about the church becoming more missionary. And he uses the language of us becoming missionary disciples. And a lot of what he's picking up, there were some that would pit him against Pope John Paul or Pope Benedict. But if you read carefully what he wrote, he's drawing on the work of those two great popes, and I think putting it into action. And I think, in lots of ways, John Paul was the great philosopher, Benedict was the great theologian, and Francis is the great pastor. Now take the theory, put it into action. Yeah. And that caused a whole lot of challenge for a whole lot of people. But Pope Francis wasn't afraid, because I think he saw in the person of the Christ, who was clearly the teacher, but also clearly the ideal of mercy. And you can't have one without the other. He wanted his priests to have the smell of the sheep. It's that image of the shepherd being beside their flock. Yeah. And I love the Christmas story when the shepherds arrived, and they were considered ritually unclean, and they came into the manger, and there was Jesus surrounded with the sheep. He smelt like them. And this is the image of the priests. He's the one who Francis is the one who talks about the church as not a place for the perfect, but a field hospital that reaches out to those in need. And we've got to have the clarity of teaching, but also we've also got to have the clarity of mercy that doesn't lose sight of those who struggle or are broken in our world.
It's pretty awesome how there's the Jubilee year of mercy. Was it extraordinary? It was an extraordinary year. Like, it wasn't, I guess, I don't know how this kind of stuff works, but I imagine he would have gone out of his way to make that happen.
Yeah, so it was, as you say, an extraordinary year of Jubilee year. So normally the Jubilee years are every 25 years. So this year we're focusing on becoming pilgrims of hope in this Jubilee year. The previous one in 2000 was celebrating 2,000 years since the birth of Christ.
Yeah.
But Francis really wanted us to focus on mercy, and it really was an extraordinary year of mercy. And he was always merciful. He was attentive to the needs of people around the world. And I've got a couple of examples of this. The first is, you'll remember that there are lots of people fleeing the poverty of Africa and wars of Africa and sailing across the Mediterranean in little boats. Francis wanted to go to Lampedusa, an island to the south of Italy, to meet with people that had been washed ashore there or had been rescued from the Mediterranean Sea. And his officials told him it would take 12 to 18 months to arrange such a visit. And he says, "Oh, okay, thank you for that." And a couple of days later, they came back to him and said, "Holy Father, we've had a phone call from Alitalia, the Italian airline, to say somebody called Jorge Bergoglio has booked a flight to Lampedusa." And he says, "Yeah, that's me." He said, "See, it doesn't take 12 to 18 months to organise these things." So he was a man of action. The other example from the Year of Mercy that's more personal to me is a story that goes back to my very early days of being a priest. And I used to visit a family who had a very sick child, and he could have up to 200 epileptic seizures each day. And when I'd go there, the mother would say, "How do you always know when to come?" And I would anoint David, and usually the seizures would dissipate and disappear. But sometimes if he was really sick, I might have to anoint him a couple of times. I got moved from that parish, and they took the child to an anointing mass, and it happened that the priest refused to anoint the child. And they rang up upset about this, and I looked up my rights of the church and saw that, yes, we're not supposed to anoint children under the age of 7. And that's because one of the effects of their anointing of the sick is forgiveness of sins, and a child can't be capable of sin, but beneath the age of reason. And with this boy, he'll never reach the age of reason. But nonetheless, I said, "Well, you know and I know that the anointing works, and I'm happy to anoint if you whenever you want." And they said, "We won't have you do what the church says you can't." And I said, "Okay, I'll write to Rome about it," which I did. And I spoke to my bishop at the time about it. He said, "You write the letter, I'll take it to Rome." And after about 18 months, I got a letter back from Rome restating the law in Latin and basically telling me to pull my head in. And so I said to the parents, if I ever meet the Pope, I'll raise the matter with him. And so in 2016, the Year of Mercy, as a newly appointed bishop, I was off to Rome for baby bishop school. And when I met the Pope, he looked very, very tired. And I had the letter, written the letter again. I had it translated into Spanish, so it was easy for him to read. But I thought he's just too tired just to try and explain this to him. So I went and spoke to his secretary and said, I have a letter for the Holy Father about our inability, according to church law, to anoint children under the age of reason. And I think he'd be quite interested in the story in this year of mercy. And the secretary said to me, I'll make sure the Holy Father gets the letter. And when I got home to Hamilton about 10 days later, sitting on my desk was a letter addressed to me, and on the back the sender was F. Casa Santa Marta, Città del Vaticano, and it was a letter from the Holy Father, handwritten, and I just thought this is quite incredible, and he thanked me for my letter. He thanked me for my zeal. He said, "You're quite right. Children can be anointed. The letter of St. James is very clear, as you say." And he said, "I've always anointed children." And he thanked me for my zeal and pastoral charity. He asked me to pray for him and to ask other people to pray for him. And there it is once again, that pray for me. And then he said, P.S. I've passed it on to the congregation for them to deal with, the dicastery. And so the dicastery hasn't done it yet. I have followed up with them, and they found... They never found they haven't found all the letters, so that's in the process of being sent back to them. I just raised it with them again last year. So, but that was the sort of person he was. He knew the struggles of people, and he wanted to respond to them.
That's amazing. That's so cool. What kind of teacher was Francis?
He was certainly different to John Paul and to Benedict, as I've said before. John Paul, I think, was a wee bit like St. Paul. He wrote complicated, long sentences. He needed a really good editor. And it took people a while to really nut out what Pope John Paul was saying. Pope Benedict was more of a teacher. He wrote a lot more simply. And it was so much more accessible to people. His encyclicals were a lot shorter than Pope John Paul's. Francis continues on with that simplicity of teaching. He's not as precise as John Paul is, and as Pope Benedict was as well. But nonetheless, Francis is a teacher in his own right. One of his great documents, Laudato Si, is on our care of our common home, the earth. And there were people, it's been really interesting in the coverage that one newscast that I heard in New Zealand was that Francis was a conservative and talking about abortion and euthanasia and the evils of those. Others thought he was a radical. And I think, in lots of ways, Laudato Si is seen to be a radical sort of teaching because it's focusing on the creation and the care of our common home, the earth. Except that both those attitudes don't capture the depth of the teaching. For Francis, all life is connected. In Laudato Si, he is concerned that our earth is really struggling at the moment. But because of that, because the land and resources are being raped, it's encouraging the displacement of the poor, displacement of peoples from the land. But also because of this consumerist ethic that we're having, we're also adopting a throwaway environment. And that's, what's happening with the unborn, and that's what's happening with our elderly. Whoa. So he's really got some powerful things to say.
Crazy.
And he ties them together. When I was Bishop of Hamilton, when it came out, I sent a copy to all the members of our parliament who lived in the Hamilton diocese.
Yeah.
Only 2 or 3 responded.
Yeah.
I'm sure none of them actually read it. But I mean, this is one of the things like Jesus. You can offer stuff to the world as Jesus did, but in the end, it's up to us whether to actually engage with the word that's spoken and to sit and reflect and to change our lives and our world.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Just as I've always seen it. I think that these are false dichotomies, by the way. Like this idea of this side and this side. Somehow he would, for want of a better way to say it, he'd piss off both sides. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this man is like a saint, because he's sitting that in the middle and is somehow at the same time saying something that's annoying both parties. But there's something quite, I think, how would I put it? There's something right about that. If you can say something that can challenge everybody, I don't know, there's something probably really true about it. I don't know, I was always kind of seen him as that kind of person.
And I think that's the sort of person we see in the Christ. Yeah. The Christ had held up the ideal of the truth, and he'd never back down from it. Yeah. But he also held up the ideal of mercy. And he never backed down from that either. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a real danger that people hold on to one or the other. And I think for us as Christians, it really is, we have to be centred on the person of Christ and his fullness. Yeah. And Francis managed to capture that. As I think previous popes have as well, Benedict and John Paul. Again, they were great men of God, but there's no formula about how to be perfect as a disciple. You look at the diversity of the saints that we've had in history, which one's the right one? And so it is that living with the paradox. And I think one of the interesting things for me about Francis was the way he seemed to rise up against those who were anti him and spoke out against him. I'm the opposite. I tend to turn into myself and wallow in self-pity. He seemed so much more to be above that.
I imagine as a bishop, you have a very unique perspective on the diocese. Like you said, like life is messy, it's complicated. And I can only imagine how much more so Pope Francis, what his perspective on not just Rome, but the world would have been.
I think the thing with the Christ is that he always saw beyond and recognised people that were on a journey. And so we see the encounter with the Syrophoenician woman. We see the encounter with the woman at the well. Francis was a man of encounter as well. And during the Amazonian Synod, during the papal mass, an image of an Amazonian goddess, Pachamama, was brought up in the offertory procession. And this caused a media furore around the world. And because following up a couple of days later, there was a prayer time up in the Vatican Gardens where there were 2 of these images facing each other. And so the image is presented as a pregnant woman. We were talking to the Holy Father about this as part of our ad limina visit with him, and he said when the image was processed up during the offertory procession at the papal mass, it was presented to him as Our Lady of the Amazon. And it was obvious that the people there had taken this image that they knew, but they'd Christianized it in the light of the gospel. And so often that's been the history of the church throughout the ages. Even, say, Thomas Aquinas, the angelic doctor, was taking philosophy that originally came from ancient Greece and Christianized it. Francis was quite relaxed about this, but so often in our world, we like to point the finger and say, well, this is not authentic. But Francis got a lot of flack about that. But he just seemed to rise up over that. I think another area and where Pope Francis was quite prophetic is on the world stage, and he realised the importance of interreligious dialogue. And in 2019, he was in Dubai and signed a document with the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, Ahmed Al-Tayeb, on human fraternity for world peace and living together. Again, it really echoes Francis and the Sultan, Francis of Assisi and the Sultan, and their dialogue. But even though we believe differently, there are things about how we live in the world that can unite us. And Francis was always very big on this. And so the following year, he released his document, Fratelli Tutti. And again, that was just so important, brothers and sisters all, Fratelli Tutti. That we're united by our humanity and we can't afford to lose sight of each other. But this dialogue with people who thought differently is very important for Francis. Dialogue is essential, and this was ultimately going to lead into synodality, which we'll talk about later. But trying to understand each other, not seeing each other as enemies. And so on the world stage, Francis is very much the man of peace who wants to avoid war, but at the same and that means talking with people that that we might find distasteful, but there he was. He wasn't going to stop engaging with anyone. And again, just reflecting on the Christ, how Jesus dialogued and entered into dialogue with Pilate. He wasn't going to bow down before the powers of this world. And Francis was the same. He wasn't afraid to speak his truth to the world. I remember hearing Helen Clark speaking about Pope Francis, and when she worked for the United Nations, and she said that of all the people in the world she was listening to at that time was Pope Francis, because he wasn't afraid of putting out challenges to the world in a way that no one else was. And I think that's always what the Christ is wanting us to be challenged by what's happening in our world and in our lives, and look for that deeper truth together.
So you mentioned synodality just before. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. Sure, synods have been part of the church's life from way back from the earliest days, but particularly for us after the Second Vatican Council, the place of the synod within the church has become more pronounced, and in particular the Synod of Bishops. The Second Vatican Council had two major documents on the church. The first, Lumen Gentium, on the dogmatic constitution of the church. Before the council, the church would describe itself as the perfect society. The principal image of Lumen Gentium was that the church is the pilgrim people of God, the people of God that are on the journey together. And that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Because every age brings up its own questions and challenges. And how do we, as the pilgrim people of God, reflect on this? And what does it say as we reflect on these things about the very nature of God? So that we hold on to the tradition and our faithfulness to the scriptures, but at the same time we try to discern our way forward. And that's what the Synod of Bishops was supposed to do, coming out of the Second Vatican Council, that they would meet every 5 years and discuss a topic, and a topic about the church in the modern world. And that was the second major document of the Second Vatican Council of the church, Gaudium et Spes, The joys and hopes, the grief and anguish of all the people of the world are the joys and hopes, the grief and anguish of the entire people of God. But especially those who are poor and vulnerable. And so since the Second Vatican Council, under the leadership of Pope Paul VI, the bishops have been meeting in synods about every 5 years. Pope Francis, and this was starting to happen even before Pope Francis, that lay people were being invited as observers. And so there was this whole change happening. But Pope Francis has gradually increased the number of lay people that are involved, and priests and religious, but also their participation. And so in 2016, I was part of the synod on young people. And so it was an interesting experience. In that synod, I had to write a 3-minute presentation which I had to speak at the synod. And at the end of 3 minutes, they switched off the microphone. You only had 3 minutes. There were some bishops who got up and they just went as if they were calling a horse race. Yeah. They were just going so fast to desperately get it in, and at the end of it, it would be just cut off. So it was a measure of trying to get what you were wanting to say together. At the end of that, so that was the morning sessions. In the afternoon session, we were able to have a little bit of a free-for-all where we could push the button and all of a sudden your face would appear on camera. Wow. and you were on, and you had another about 2 minutes to say what you wanted to say. And
that sounds fun.
Yeah, it was. And so this particular afternoon, and the Holy Father wasn't there. He was always there at the morning sessions, but he often wasn't there at the afternoon sessions. And it popped up that I could speak at that. And wow. And my intervention was, here we are, even in the youth synod, talking about a more synodal church where people are invited to participate more. And I said, but we've got the Pope with the white hat sitting down the front, the cardinals with the red hats sitting in the front rows, then the bishops with their pink hats behind them, and then all you lay people up the back there. I said, if we're a more synodal church, we'd be all mixed up. Well, the young people there in the auditorium were all clapping and cheering this, while I got a few frowns from the cardinals with their red hats. But one of the interventions was by a young Aucklander, he's Samoan New Zealander, yeah. And Joe talked about the image of his ancestors in Samoa sailing in the great waka, the big great canoes, and how they relied on the wisdom of the elders to guide and steer the waka, the canoes, or vaka in the Samoan, but they relied on the strength of the young people to paddle it. And he says this is a model for the church. Wow. At the end of it, and it was a great image that Joe painted so well. At the end of his intervention, all the young people around him were congratulating him. And people in the auditorium were clapping. What he didn't realise, because he was so busy shaking hands with the young people, was that Pope Francis was just staring at him and just clapping, And I just thought of that image, Jesus and the rich young man. Jesus looked at him and loved him, and that was the look of Francis to this man, this young man from Auckland, and that intervention appeared in the final document, Christus Vivit.
Wow.
Francis had a great love for the young people, and he wanted them allow their voice to be heard at the synod. And it was really interesting in our small group. The cardinal who was in charge of our English small group, Cardinal Donato from Houston, said to the young people, look, you can speak whenever you want to, and you can vote as well, even though we're not supposed to do that. We want to hear what you're saying. Meanwhile, some of the young people said to me, some of the other language groups, that they weren't even allowed to speak.
That's so weird.
So this was the sort of thing Francis was wanting to get that voice, and the voice of the whole people of God. And so even before that synod, there was a whole consultation on the state of young people. We'd also had that in the synod on marriage and family life, and out of which came the document Amoris Laetitia. And one of the criticisms that came out of that was it's too sociological. It's talking about all the problems in marriage and family life. It's not clear enough on its teaching. Yeah. But the problem is, how can we teach if we're not actually speaking to the people that are trying to live this life? It's not about just giving a theory. It's also about responding to the needs and struggles of people. And I think this is what Francis is really wanting for the church, a church that is able to meet people where they're at, but take them on a journey, not stay where they are, but take them on a journey. And I think often you'll get people saying, oh, well, who am I to judge? This is the papal teaching, but that's all they look at. Yeah. And that's shortchanging Francis. You know, our media is very much using the soundbite, and that's a great soundbite that they like using. Yeah. But it doesn't take about the wider picture, where he really wants to take people beyond where they are now, more deeper into the mystery of Christ. And that always involves us losing a little bit more of ourselves.
Wow. It reminds me of, I don't know if you've heard of it or seen it, but on Disney Plus, there was, I want to say it was like an hour and a half sort of long thing where he sat down with Spanish-speaking young adults and then just said, ask me anything. And it was amazing because he didn't, like you said, he didn't back down on like the church's stance on stuff, but he was just like, had this willingness to say like, hey, like no question's a bad question, ask away, and listen. And like he listened to them. Mm-hmm. I just thought it was such a, it was a really beautiful example of that kind of, I guess, the spirit of like the idea behind the synod, to listen and to, like you said, meet people where they are. Mm. Like he led by example.
Absolutely. And when we were there for the ad limina visit, I talked to him about a Grill the Bishop session that I'd had with him. And the questions was about, you know, pornography and about sex before marriage. And I told the Holy Father about the encounter and I was asked and how I responded to it, and the shock, the school principal about a question that I was asked. And at the end of it, recounting this, the Holy Father just laughed and he says, "Look, we should never be scandalised by how our young people are living or the questions they ask." But he says, but isn't it great that that young person was able to ask you the questions that were deepest on his heart? And he says this is where the church needs to be, where we need to not be afraid to be to listen and to respond and to accompany young people on the journey. And for Francis, that accompaniment, and that was the big theme really of the Youth Synod and Christus Vivit, the document that followed that, it used the image of Jesus walking with the two disciples after Emmaus, towards Emmaus, walking away from the cross, even though they're going in the wrong direction. You know, Jesus listened to them and didn't butt in as they told him their truth. And only then, and they're still walking in the wrong direction, did he started speaking to them. And when they got to that moment of encounter and enlightenment and they turned back, his part was done.
Yeah.
Now it's you. Now you're on the right track. And I think for Francis, that's the sort of thing that he is proposing for the church, that we accompany everybody, no exception. Yeah. No matter if they've got it wrong in their lives at this point. For him, the journey is the important thing, not the individual moment. And I think that's how I'd like to face my judgment. It was the direction of my journey, It's just not about the snapshot I died and I was in a perfect state of grace, but how had my heart been transformed? And I think that was what Francis knew.
Could you talk about Pope Francis and prayer?
Yeah. Yeah, as I said before, I mean, Francis was an incredible man of God, and for him, the prayer life is really, really important. I think to understand him, you actually have to understand him as a Jesuit priest.
Oh, yeah, true.
And for the Jesuits, very much centred on the teaching of St. Ignatius of Loyola, and that discernment of spirits. And so this is really, really important for Francis. As part of the spiritual exercises that St. Ignatius placed before the church, people praying those spiritual exercises really have to enter into the scene of the scripture encounters, and using their imagination, paint a picture of the scene of the person of Christ, and where we are in it as well. And it's in this that Christ speaks to us in our imagination. Now, there's some people think,
subjective experience.
This is subjective experience, exactly.
Yeah.
But this is where Christ speaks to us. He doesn't. We don't hear him through our ears. But it's that thing. It's that the Spirit rising in within us, that he reveals images to us, words to us, and that we really have that encounter with the risen Christ. I remember talking to one priest, and he'd just done the 30-day exercises, and he says, I pray. And this was a great priest of prayer. And he says, but I felt as if I'd never prayed before in my life. This is the experience Francis had of prayer, and we can see that in the way he brought the scriptures to life. And I think what he wanted for the church, again, flowing out of the Second Vatican Council, is for us to grow in holiness. And so one of his apostolic exhortations, Gaudete and Exsultate, rejoice and be glad, was for the church to grow in its holiness again, in our individual prayer, but also in the prayer of the church, particularly the Mass. And he put before the church, a couple of errors that have always plagued the church down through the ages. Gnosticism, as if we've got some secret knowledge of the spiritual life, and that I've got the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And then Pelagianism, which is all about getting to holiness by our own efforts, rather than seeing it as the work of God. But for Francis, holiness was accessible to everyone. And so often in our world that we forget that call of the Second Vatican Council, that each one of us is called to holiness. One of the things I suggested to the media in the last few days is that the command of Jesus, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, and your neighbour as yourself. And I think Francis has got this in his teachings. He's clearly the man of God who really loves the Lord with his whole life and just gives himself in his love and service. We see that in his outreach to the poor and his neighbour. He's always reaching out. That love of self, in that in the sense of discerning, the discerning heart of the Pope, because this is where God meets us in ourselves. But for Francis, the other thing that he was doing, adding to the command of Jesus, is loving the creation of which we are a part. And I think that's, again, another aspect of his prayer life. And like Francis of Assisi, who could see the beauty of creation and talking about, our brothers and sisters and the animals and the stars and the moon. Francis is very much about this. So prayer becomes the centre for this relatedness to everything. For liturgy, again, the Holy Father wanted us to enter into silence and enter into the mystery. That liturgy, the Mass in particular, should be celebrated beautifully. It shouldn't become cluttered and become abstract, but that really leads people into the divine presence. He hated when there were bishops celebrating, when they'd pull out phones and take photos. Whenever you saw him, presiding, there'd be no waving to the crowds walking down the aisle. He was always had his eyes fixed on the cross. Again, he didn't like the royal handshake going down the aisles, and that's something that I'm really big on too. I'll just look straight ahead on the cross. I will not be handshaking as you go. And though I must admit, the final Mass, as I was walking into the St. Peter's Basilica with all the concelebrating bishops for the final Mass of the Youth Synod, and a couple of times as I walked down the aisle, here's Bishop Steve, and here were some Kiwis waving. So, but I looked over and looked straight back. The other image too, I think, of Francis as the man of God is that image of him during COVID. Walking through St. Peter's Square that was empty and dark. The Pope dressed in white, speaking a message of hope to a world that was locked down. Yeah. And so an incredible man of so many complexities.
Yeah. I think even just the timing of it all, there's something quite special about it. It's a year of, there's just a wisdom in this year being about hope.
Mm-hmm. And he's always tried to be a man of hope. I think that's right. One of the areas where he has had some criticism about, and I think he'd be the first to admit this himself, is his handling of the sexual abuse crisis. He got that wrong in Chile. With an appointment he made early on. I think it took him a while to learn. But in saying that, he's like bishops around the world trying to get a head around the crisis of sexual abuse in the church, but also in the world. How do we actually deal with this? He has established a pontifical commission on this. He called all the presidents of bishops' conferences from around the world and really laid into them about what he expects for the church. But this will continue to be a wound that festers in the church, which in itself is just a minute reflection of the wound of those people who are abused themselves. He, on a numerous occasion, met with survivors and was always deeply moved by that. And a lot of the things that he did we'll never know about, but certainly I know with some that he's remained in contact with, or there were particular stories that he's followed up in his own way. But it is that sort of thing. We live in a world where people are supposed to be perfect, and I don't think that's possible. I know my own struggles as bishop here in New Zealand, responding adequately to this area. I do the best I can. Sometimes I do okay. Other times I get it wrong. And
I wonder, and I don't know if you've thought about this in the last few days, about how the timing of his passing, there's something kind of like obviously there's people, we kind of read a bit too much into things sometimes, but even just the story of it, there's a level of really beautiful symbolism, I think, in him passing away on Easter Monday.
Yeah, and I think I was really touched by that as well.
Yeah.
In recent times, this is the second Pope to die in the octave of Easter. Pope John Paul II died on Divine Mercy Sunday, which was the perfect day for him.
Whoa, I didn't realise.
And so, but one of the things that I saw in these weeks leading up to this time was how the Pope's health was really compromised. And there's always a bit of speculation. When I was in Rome, even then, for the Synod on Young People, there was even then the talk of papabile, which is who will be suitable to be the next Pope. Yeah. And I think that talk has been happening a little bit recently because of the Pope's failing health. And last year I met him in Papua New Guinea, and he was already in the wheelchair then. And he had quite an extensive tour. He was in Papua New Guinea, East Timor, Indonesia, and Singapore. This was to be his only visit to Oceania, and I think he really wanted to come here, even though he was in the wheelchair, and to be close to people. And just not there in Port Moresby, he went up to Vanimo, which is right on the Indonesian-Papua New Guinea border, where there's real issues of poverty and struggle. But he wanted to be there, and he wanted to be close to people always. And at the Port Moresby, I got to meet him again. It was just another handshake opportunity. He greeted the Papua New Guinea bishops first, and then those of us who were representing the wider area of Oceania, so I was representing New Zealand, went up, and I was the first one from outside PNG, I think, and I went up to him and said, Holy Father, Steve Lowe, Bishop of Auckland in New Zealand. And this big grin came on his face, and he gave me a big thumbs up. And I think he was delighted that Oceania was represented in its wholeness. And I think that same courage and determination to get out there as the shepherd of the whole church is what we saw on Easter Sunday. There he was, out greeting the pilgrims. He was really struggling about what he was going to, even just saying, Bona Pasqua, happy Easter, was a real struggle. But as a pastor, he wanted to be with God's people. And then, quite providentially, the Lord called him home. It wasn't the pneumonia that got him or the compromised lung, but it was a stroke. And in the midst of that, it's a beautiful thing for us as Catholics. Every day of this octave of Easter is as if it's Easter Sunday, the day of resurrection. And as the man of hope, who calls us to be pilgrims of hope, and he certainly was a pilgrim of hope. But when he launched the Jubilee year, he used those lines of St. Paul, hope doesn't disappoint. And I guess my prayer for Francis now is that his hope was not disappointed, that he had the encounter with the risen Christ just as Mary Magdalene had the encounter on that Easter day, and that the Lord said to him, Jorge, Francis as he calls him from death to life.